Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Very pleased to be joined by Andrea Samadi, who is the founder, author, and creator of Achieve It 360, an educational consulting firm she founded in 2012. She's also the host of Neuroscience Meets Social Emotional Learning podcast, and we're very happy to have her on as a guest today. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mike, for having me today.
Regular listeners to the show know that we frequently talk about neuroscience, and we love to talk about brains, and we also love to talk about social and emotional learning. In fact, I like to say, I get socio-emotional, baby, regularly on the show because I like to break into song whenever possible. So the fact that you were able to hit two of our zeitgeisty words in trending in education, one being neuroscience and the other being social emotional learning, that's super relevant, and it sets a nice foundation for us to go a little deeper on some of this stuff. Can you talk a little bit about how the Neuroscience Meets Social Emotional Learning podcast came into being?
Definitely. Well, before it was a podcast, I actually connected the two ideas, neuroscience and social emotional learning, together because I was urged to go that route from an educator that was working with my programs. And he said, I really see that you need to make your programs brain-based. And this was back in 2014. I was given grant money to work with schools in Arizona. And that's really where it started. He said, you don't have to do this, but I'd really like to see you write another book. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh no, do I give him his money back or do I do what he's saying? And when you receive criticism, he did it in such a way because he was an experienced educator, former superintendent, that I really wanted to do what he was suggesting. And he was in his office and he takes all these books off his bookshelf, D'Souza's How the Brain Learns. And he was giving me all of his most valuable resources. Yeah. And I thought, if I don't do this, this is going to be really bad. So I thought I better figure this out. And so that's really where it started. I was lucky at the time that I was mentoring with John Asraf, who's had a neuroscience researcher. I was able to call up and say, hey, can you help me make this connection? And when I was given Mark Waldman's research, he actually gave me everything he was working on, a book he hadn't even published yet. And I completely saw how the 5 competencies of social emotional learning, and I added the growth mindset in there for the 6. Yeah. But I saw how they really connected to the brain and neuroscience. And so that's where the title came from. And I actually had social emotional learning meets neuroscience first. And I threw that past a bunch of educators that I work with at the Department of Ed. And they said, let's put neuroscience first because everyone's tired of hearing about social emotional learning. Yeah. It's been thrown around out there. Let's put the focus on neuroscience. So before this was even a podcast, that's where that came from. Yeah. I wrote the curriculum based on the Level Up book. The program came out. And then I presented it in Toronto to York Region schools at a conference. And I was told my session was the first to sell out before the event even began. Nice. And I hadn't even presented this yet. This was just ideas that I saw through this research. And it was all very new to me. And I remember, I had to practice so hard to get those 3 parts of the brain down. And then, it was taken really well. We had over 300 people come to each of the sessions. People were lined up against the walls. And so, that's where I knew I had something. Yeah. So when I was actually looking to redo my website last January, I bought a template that had a podcast theme. And I'd always been interviewing people. I have an online membership area where all my programs are for the students and teachers. So interviewing people wasn't new, but the podcast was. I looked it up. The developer said, you can delete that section if you don't want it on your website. And I thought, well, let's just see what's involved. And I Googled, how do you start a podcast? And there was all this stuff about syndicated. Yeah. I didn't even know what it was, how to get started, but you can easily figure out anything. And that's really where the podcast started. Yeah. Just in June, I thought, let's just do this. And I was shocked at how it took off. It started very slowly. And you start getting listeners, you got to put content out, but then
Yeah.
it builds and the momentum builds on its own. So
Next thing you know, you're appearing on Trending in Education. Like it's a real Cinderella story, you know?
it's crazy the amount of people that contact me for their shows,
Yeah.
for conferences now. I'm always
Yeah.
getting messages on Twitter.
Well, when you were talking, it sounds like the peanut butter and chocolate eureka moment happened. And frequently that is the case nowadays too, where like, folks tend to get expertise in one sort of narrow thing and they don't necessarily make the lateral connection. And then I think if you can find interesting pairings to make those types of connections, and neuroscience and social emotional learning makes perfect sense. It's almost like the way we have this arbitrary distinction between the arts and sciences. We almost think if something's emotional in nature, that there isn't some sort of neurochemical foundation, neurological brain functioning aspect to the concept. And that's actually incorrect. Like how we feel physically and how our neurons are firing and how our neural activity through the hormones in our brains, those are physical measurable things that we feel, quote, in my scare quotes for our listeners are only in my visual space right now, but we feel things that can be measured as hard science. So can you talk a little bit about how the interplay between social emotional learning and neuroscience has brought some interesting revelations or insights to you?
Definitely. So we've got the social part of social and emotional. So just think about that, the social brain. We've got how to navigate social situations, resolving conflict, showing respect towards others. So those are all the social skills that we have. And then there's a lot of research out there about the social brain. You just Google social brain. There's a lot out there. When we feel threatened or rejected in a group, we turn to the fight or flight with our brain. So, there's that whole aspect. Growing up, what it felt like when you were in middle school and high school if you didn't belong. Just now we can understand that with our own kids or with our students, that, the way that we feel about world tragedies is how our young students are feeling about inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about how their brains are shutting down. So just understanding that part with the social, these are all skills that we now know we need to teach in the schools, and the curriculum is coming in with that.
Yeah.
And then we've got the whole emotional side. So emotions come into the brain with a stimulus that triggers the body for a certain response, and then it hits our limbic system, sends messages to our amygdala, and then our hippocampus with our memory. It's all connected. So we've now got to understand our own emotions and the emotions of others. So there's the social side, there's the emotional side, recognizing and managing our emotions, others, and the ability to cope with frustration, disappointments, and stress. And I actually interviewed Mark Brackett. He was the founder of the Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence, and his new and most recent book, Permission to Feel. It's so interesting because he talks about how, we're not taught to talk about our feelings at all. And he did this activity. He said, show me on your face what anger looks like. And anyone can show anger, but show me on your face what love looks like. And the whole room, nobody could do it. And I was thinking myself, I'm like, I know what love feels like. It's, unmistakable. When you feel love,
Right.
But what does that look like? I have no idea.
Yeah.
So when you were talking before about what areas do you think we still need to dive deep into? Well, I think we understand the social side, but the emotional side, it's not, been the norm to talk about our feelings out loud.
Yeah.
Say how we're feeling. And then the third part brings in those academic and cognitive skills, the skills our brain needs to think, reason, remember. And we all know what those executive functions are. They're in the prefrontal cortex, like focusing and setting goals. And there's a lot of research about ways to improve the executive function. But putting all these three things together, the social, emotional, and cognitive, in your opinion, what do you think we need to pay attention to?
I think the connections among the three is where I really feel sometimes we almost miss the through line, so that's why, like, the fact that, you talk about the feeling of love, or there was I shared that Harvard Business Review article where they were measuring levels of oxytocin in their subjects' blood. Like, I was like, they were actually testing oxytocin levels by drawing blood before and after an intervention, which the fact that they got that through a human subjects board, I think was pretty impressive to begin with. But the idea that there are measurable ways to get feedback on social and emotional cognitive states, I think we're just at the early stages of making that feedback, less invasive. So, like, less drawing of blood, less putting on the tinfoil cap, and more like through some sort of passive monitoring, getting a read on the level of trust and psychological safety you have within your classroom. Like, starting to make that more transparent. Or if you're teaching online, how do you capture nonverbals so that you can sync up with the emotional state of the people you're trying to communicate with? I think a lot of that will remain sort of ineffable, intangible, unmeasurable. But I think increasingly the science is showing us that some of these things can actually be measured. And that's where I think the real breakthroughs will happen in the future, is like making transparent to a teacher through use of technology, feedback, monitoring, new levels of insight into understanding and comprehension from their classroom. And then I think that also happens in the other direction for the learner themselves. Like, I use Strava, I've used, Duolingo, I play a lot of fantasy sports, and all those things provide really rich data sets. The whole quantified self movement. I think the quantified self, as it relates to the learner, we're still in a very early stage. So, like, if I could get some biofeedback, after I'm taking a high stakes test or after I'm doing a public speaking engagement, to see, how agitated was I, and were there points where I was too hype and I needed to calm down? Were there points where I was too calm and I needed to amp up? I think those types of problems are going to potentially begin to be solved in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, where simple feedback mechanisms will give teachers and learners access to new ways to kind of change behavior, break patterns. And I know I did want to make sure we talked about some of your thinking about how to break patterns, because I thought that was really interesting. And then the other thing maybe we could start with is the 3 modes of brain functioning, which I saw you did a post about. It's the salient, executive, and default modes. And I saw a really good Vox explainer about this, but I think you went into further depth than I saw there. And I think all that then feeds back to what I was saying. Like, that's where, metacognition and awareness of the mode that I'm in, and then some intentionality, so that, okay, now I want to affect change. I want to shift how I'm thinking, how I'm operating. That stuff's really, really interesting, because I think that'll unlock new opportunities to change behavior. So can you talk a little bit about both those things, like those modes, and then how to affect behavioral change?
Yeah, definitely. So if you were to ask me what my favorite part of the brain was, back in 2014, I only knew the 3 parts of the brain that Mark Waldman taught me. Then when I interviewed him in December, he said, let's scrap all that. I want to talk to you about the salient network, the central executive network, and the last one is the default mode network. And that's what he's focused on now. And it's pretty powerful, because few people have learned how to intuitively self-reflect on the deeper issues and struggles that we have. So when we're able to have relaxed, intuitive inquiry in our brain, that's the salient network. And when we can think about our problems, that's using the prefrontal cortex, the central executive network. And then, but most of us are stuck in the default mode network, our worries and our fears. So there's an amazing strategy or step process that Waldman taught me on the interview that I did with him, And a lot of the athletes are doing it. You know, you've got a problem, if you're going in for a test, or you've got something important at work, you've got to first of all relax, visualize. You see the athletes doing it before a game. I was blown away when I saw a baseball player sitting on the field. Instead of practicing, he was meditating.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to relax your body. That's when the creative insights flow into your brain. And Dr. Srini Pillai wrote a whole book on this, Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try. He's a Harvard professor, and he talks about the fact that, you know, Einstein created his theory of relativity in a dream.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to have those breaks where we stop thinking, and we're so busy these days. We're go, go, go. You know, I have to wake up early to practice this because otherwise it will never get done. And the fact that I'm researching all these people and I have all these tools, I think, you know, where am I going to put this? Well, I've got to wake up a bit before everybody else does so that I can practice this. But
there's a trade-off there because you need to get your sleep too, you know? So like,
exactly.
What do you do?
Go to bed early. And then sleep is always on my list. I could do with probably another half hour.
Yeah.
But, you know, right now it's so important to me that I'm learning this stuff. So I wake up and I'm ready to go. So
I have a 1-year-old at home, so I'm sort of punting on sleep for a little while, but
right.
I'm a big believer in its power.
Right, I couldn't have done this with a 1-year-old. So, but it's getting to those places where we can relax. It doesn't have to be an hour in the middle of the day. If you could go for a walk, take a break from what you're doing, a brain break. We're trying to get there in the classroom. I have superintendents that listen to the podcast with these ideas, and they say, okay, how could we put this in the classroom when it's so high stress? Bam, bam, bam. You've got to get through the curriculum.
Right.
And it's going to take time to get there, but it has to be the way it goes because the brain needs a break. And that's just the way that it's going to learn. Learning consolidation takes place. Those aha moments, you're not going to get there by staring at that math problem and trying to jam into it. You're going to get there by walking away, by brainstorming with someone else. So those aha moments are the only way by giving the brain a break. So
and we were talking about this heading in too, is like when you think about the way the workplace is changing, you know, like increasingly it's going to be the job of humans to have more aha moments because the more, you know, rote things that could be done by a human are going to be automated. So it's becoming increasingly important to have the social emotional skills, which I've heard creativity thrown into the mix in terms of social and emotional learning. And I certainly think of it that way, where like in order to break out of sort of the rut of routinized thinking and, you know, Daniel Kahneman talks about, you know, fast and slow thinking. So like to actually break out of some of those ruts of the default mode network, you know, we need to learn how to both notice when we're in that rut and then adopt practices for ourselves that break the negative aspects of that sort of feedback loop. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to become aware. You know, so metacognition is something I've seen you write about. I know it's a big deal in terms of all of this. And then B, having the ability to break off of the old routines and adopt new ones. Because it seems like you need all of those things to really, you know, become a fuller version of who you are. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, definitely. And it's kind of funny because I'm right in the middle of a 90-day breaking a habit system here. So in order to explain something, if I'm living it, then it comes through far more authentically. But so as far as the metacognition or the thinking about our thinking, that was actually, I created a graphic with Mark Waldman. He had something in there with regards to his work. And I could actually see as we went through the steps, let's just say you're a student in the classroom and you're learning something. You go through the steps of learning and you get to a place where you've got to start thinking about the strategies you're using. Maybe the radio playing or the TV playing is not working. So you've got to think about your thinking. Is this strategy working? Am I getting the results? And that takes effort to, first of all, think, is this working? And second, to make a change and say, okay, I got to shut off my phone. It's distracting me got to do things differently. So as we're training ourselves and training our students, we've got to start thinking of ways that we're building them to make these self-correction strategies with their learning.
Mm-hmm.
And we can learn anything when we have the right learning strategies in place.
Right.
Anything is possible. But so there's that whole side of it. And then with regards to breaking a habit, well, anything is possible if we can replace the bad habit with a good habit. So, you know, it's hard to think about with regards to working. I can only think about it when I'm writing it and relate it to studying. So if you've got a habit of doing things a certain way and you're not getting the results, you've got to go back and change things. And it's uncomfortable. It's not as pleasurable. It's harder work. But those are the things that we have to do to self-correct. Anytime we're breaking a habit, it's probably something we like doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, you don't want to drink coffee every day anymore. You replace it with water, hot water with lemon. And, you know, that sounds just so exciting, but it feels great. You might notice you have more energy, you're more focused, you're more clear. And as you get the benefits of whatever habit you're changing, that's how you keep going with the habit.
Right.
Maybe you say, okay, I'm done with the hot lemon, I'm going to go back to my coffee, and you notice, wow, I'm not as focused. So it will give you the motivation, but you've got to have that motivation and know why you're changing. And that's the whole thing behind why we're studying. Why are we actually sitting here doing all these, changing all these learning strategies? There's got to be the end result or the bigger purpose of what we're going for.
Right.
And most people don't know what our why is, and that's why we need to take the time to focus and know why are we doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we can get those long-term habits to change from things that aren't working to things that are. When we see the traction, then it's more desirable to have that hot lemon water instead of the coffee, or do half decaf.
Right. Well, and the related thing that you mentioned, I think in the same article, is the importance of having an accountability buddy as well, which I think also puts us back into a social context as well, where, like, you know, if we think improving ourselves, affecting behavioral change, in some ways, I think it's why people talk publicly about their New Year's resolutions, is like, you want to be out there. If you don't say you're going to change, if you don't tell people I want to be held accountable, it's easy to let yourself slip back into old behaviors. But if you're very overt and intentional about the behavioral change you're trying to affect, and then you enlist folks who are trying to do the same thing, I thought that was also, a good insight. And to me, it was another example of how these things do sort of tie together, in that it's always a social, you know, I think we underestimate how social and emotional everything is in human experience. And that's why I think SEL is such a big deal. But then it's easy to sort of think of that as separate from brain functioning and separate from insights from, like, cognitive science, neuroscience, and learning science. And I like the more holistic thinking that you and others like you are bringing to bear on this. I'd love to get your perspective on cutting edge technology. So, like, since we're a future facing show, we try to stay on top of what's new and exciting and emerging in the world. So, like, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence. We did a show recently on brain computer interfaces, which are beginning to mature. We've also talked a bit about augmented reality, virtual reality, and the list will continue to go on because new technologies are going to emerge. Are there any in particular that excite your imagination, or you think have more direct relationship to social and emotional learning? And I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, definitely. When I first heard about augmented reality, I found this company online. It was called Magic Leap. And I'm so serious. I had their name up on my wall as someone that I thought, I'm going to somehow work with these people. They had developed something, and I think it was through glasses that the students put on, where a whale jumped out of the floor in the middle of an assembly. And I just thought, oh my goodness, this is it. This is the way it's going to go, because, you know, school was not exciting for me. I'm learning so much more now, but I wish I was learning like this in school. If only my school was engaging.
Yeah.
And then I see what they're creating and I think this is the answer.
Right.
But it didn't actually take off that way. I don't see schools all over the world with these whales jumping out of the gym floor.
Yeah.
But they are using virtual reality in the classrooms with brains turning around in the PE classes. I interviewed someone, my second interview, they're actually doing it in PE class, getting the kids to move. Anyone that I've talked to, they're using it. It's becoming more and more affordable. So I think as technologies become more affordable, that's when they can get into the schools. That really it's difficult for some schools to buy some of these new things without the funding, but it's definitely the way I see. But I thought this, when I first saw augmented reality, then I was trying to think, well, how could we get students to learn about these social emotional skills? You had some good ideas about inclusion and empathy.
Yeah. There's been a little more research about that, about using VR, virtual reality in particular, to help teach empathy, where you can really begin to experience what it's like to be someone else. And frequently, the reason why folks have those biases is that they've never really been exposed to what it feels like to be on the other side. The example I remember from a New York article a few years back was in the case of domestic abusers. They frequently had never been in the context, the feeling, the perception of being physically intimidated by their spouse. And in some cases, I think there was a positive effect after that intervention, that it's almost like you can teach empathy through use of virtual reality. And then I think the related space that I'm really fascinated by is simulations, and teaching through simulations, particularly for like high stakes, limited access things. Like, like if you're training to be a pilot, obviously you're going to use a flight simulator in addition to your real flight time. Or if you're trying to, learn how to operate a very highly technical apparatus of some kind that you can only get in a particular lab. Now that access to at least simulations like that are going to be democratized, so that everybody can at least get the sort of preliminary training and experience under their belts. So yeah, I think there'll be a lot of interesting stuff around all of this as we careen into the future. One thing that we talked a little bit about, and you kind of touched on it, is the challenges of the rate of change within K-12 versus within the workplace versus higher ed or pre-K and formal learning. I do respect your work and the work of folks who are trying to make an impact within K-12, but frequently, even though the learners may be the most malleable and flexible, frequently the structure and of the institution itself makes it really hard to implement the sort of cutting edge emerging capabilities. Can you share a little bit of your perspective on that? Because you've been both a middle school teacher, and now you've been consulting in the space, both in schools and then also in workplaces. I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on that.
Definitely. When I ask everyone that's an expert, how long do you think this is going to take? I've been following CASEL. They're the leaders in this movement, watching how the standards have changed. I've watched every webinar since 2014, where they had, barely any states with SEL standards. Now, we're half the country is SEL standards. At least I think 70% of the country now has SEL on their website. So
right.
SEL is definitely making an impact. It's in the schools. Most people know what it is. They just don't know how to get started on it. So what I'm seeing, it's working in pockets. If there's always, when you present, there's always 5 or 6 people that come up at the end of a presentation that want to know everything. They're those go-getters. There's those types of people in the school as well, those go-getters that are the change makers. Those are the people that are going to get this information, take it to their district, start in their school, and then making the change in their school. So that's how it's getting into the schools. Mm-hmm. There are people out there doing incredible work. Dr. Lori Desitel is now training teachers. You can get your master's in educational neuroscience and bring it into your school. So there are movements. It's just not taking off across the board. So those movements are happening. Educators, if you're interested, model it yourself, model it in the home. And then that's how we're going to have a better workplace where our students, our employees are going to be better prepared with these social skills that we need. We need them for, you're in a hotel and something's not right in your hotel. You don't just call down to the front desk screaming. You got to know the proper way to ask for what you need.
Right.
It translates all across life. So
yeah, and if anything, what I've seen is, at least on the workplace side, there's more measurement of the health and engagement of your culture. And when you start measuring that, maybe they'll get to a point where they can, get more neuroscientific about it. But they're at least, based on surveys and other engagement metrics, there are ways to understand how being cognizant of social and emotional components of your workplace ultimately leads to better business performance. And I think that's in some ways not as true in more traditional educational settings. So I think the actual measurement and motivation to change quickly is more likely going to crop up in the workplace development side, where being novel may give you a competitive advantage and there really are fewer constraints on your ability to try some kind of new intervention. Whereas I think in K-12 or even in higher ed, there's so many other demands on the teacher and the classroom dynamics that, sure, like the top 5-10% may have the ambition and the resources and the capability to sort of affect these sort of transformative things. But I think increasingly, I'm looking more to workplace development, lifelong learning as the space, at least in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, where more innovation is going to be happening. And then I think once it works in those contexts, the other space that I think is super interesting is early childhood development. But from those two ends, I think are where we'll see more profound transformative models. And then ideally that could then power back into K-12. Although to your point, it's impressive, it reminds me of the Bill Gates quote, we overestimate how much change there'll be in 2 years. We underestimate how much change there'll be in 10. And if you think about social and emotional learning 10 years ago, it wasn't really a thing. And now it's everywhere. And in some ways, I do think the connection to neuroscience is probably spot on in terms of where this momentum will likely go, particularly if we continue to see advances in the research side, and then we can figure out how to translate that research back into the classroom. We're coming up on time, Andrea, and I'd love to have you back. It's a fascinating conversation. One of the questions we always ask our guests is, and I think we've talked about a lot of the trends, but what trends are capturing your imagination these days? What research are you looking at? What technologies are emerging? What new interventions are you seeing that you think might be gaining momentum as we head into the 2020s?
Definitely the mindfulness movement, because I worked very closely with this young man. He's a teenager and he's trying to get mindfulness in the schools out in Florida. And he's part of this whole mindfulness summit, bringing us back into, what Waldman talked about with the salient and default networks. So right now it's the whole taking that time to understand my own self. What are my thoughts and feelings, so that I can understand others better, paying attention to intuitions. What am I feeling? Only by taking breaks and by strengthening my own brain can I get there. So when I interviewed the last person, that's not edited yet, but the last person I interviewed talked a lot about what's happening from a neuroscientific side with growth mindset. So the fact that when we're practicing things, the myelin goes over the pathway, making it simple and easy. So some of these things that feel weird in the beginning, understanding the neuroscience behind it.
Yeah. Mindfulness is everywhere these days. And our listeners can't see you, but Andrea is in fact levitating. No, I'm kidding. She's not. So it's a great conversation, Andrea. What's the best way for folks who want to hear more to keep track of you and get access to more of this great content?
Definitely. You can find me at my website, achieveit360.com, achieveit360.com, or you could find my podcast, Neuroscience Meets Social Emotional Learning, Andrea Samadi, anywhere you find podcasts. On social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, just put my name in there and you'll see me.
Awesome. Thanks again, Andrea, for joining. And for our listeners, we'll be back again soon on Trending in Education.